invite you to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, For All the Saints, number 103 in your gray hymnal. Could you be one too? Could you be a saint? Could any of us? Our forebears, the Puritans, believed that the world was made up of saints and strangers. Saints had taken Jesus into their hearts and would be saved by God's decree, and strangers were unknown, had not confessed their faith, or were not fully admitted to communion. These days, most Protestants don't speak of saints except to talk about people we want to emulate and who seem to have superhuman patience or generosity or goodwill or self-discipline. They are, more often than not, defined by being better than us, whomever we are. But it turns out that most of the everyday people who achieved sainthood are odd characters who were blessed with some miraculous occurrence in their lives, and their sainthood flowed not from the overflowing of goodness, but by the overflowing of odd circumstances around them. This morning, we hear some of the stories of these odd and wondrous folks, and between their stories, we'll sing the verses of the hymn whose words are printed in your order of worship. So we'll hear the melody of that hymn once through before we start to hear the stories.
Moses the Black was a slave in 4th century Egypt who was convicted thief and a suspected murderer. After doing time for his crimes, he gathered a pack of ne'er-do-wells to rob and pillage towns along the Nile Valley. On the run from the authorities, he asked for shelter with a group of monks who so inspired him with their devotion that he converted to Christianity and joined their order. But like any criminal trying to turn over a new leaf, Moses found that old habits die hard. When robbers invaded the monastery, he captured them, beat and dragged them into the chapel, asking his elder monk what to do with them. To his surprise, the elder monk released them. Eventually, Moses learned the ways of nonviolence and became a teacher of pacifism to his fellow monks. During an attack to the monastery, he convinced his brothers to retreat rather than to fight back, helped most of them to escape, and then stayed behind to greet the attackers. He and 7 other monks were killed while greeting their foes peacefully. Moses the Black is the patron saint of Africa.
Saint Margaret of Antioch. Margaret was the daughter of a pagan priest in the 3rd century, and when she converted to Christianity, it did not go over well with her father. She was set to be married to a Roman, which would have required her to give up her faith in Christ. She refused. She was tortured terribly, but even as she was, a series of miraculous events took place. Satan took the form of a dragon and swallowed her, but her cross tickled his insides, and she escaped when everything came out the way it went in. They tried to burn her, but the flames didn't touch her. When she was bound hand and foot and dumped into the water, her prayers released her ties, and she jumped out of the water uninjured. She was eventually killed, but more than 1,000 years after her death, in the year 1304, she is said to have appeared and coached Joan of Arc during her battles against the English. Saint Margaret is one of the 14 holy helpers and is a special patron saint of pregnant women.
Saint Leginus. You may have heard the story of the nearly blind Roman centurion who teased and poked Jesus in the side as he hung from the cross. What you may not know is that even he would wind up a saint. As legend has it, blood and water from Jesus' wound dripped into Leginus' eyes, restoring his full vision. He was converted on the spot, proclaiming, "Truly, this man is the Son of God." He went on to convert many souls, and even after he was arrested for his faith, and his teeth were pulled, and his tongue was cut out, he was able to speak clearly as he testified to the power of God and destroyed several idols in the presence of the governor before he was sentenced to death. Leginus is the patron saint of people with poor eyesight, of labor, of power, and of good discernment.
This morning is how Patrick became a saint. St. Patrick was a Romano-British Christian missionary and bishop in Ireland, known as the, oh, well, hello there, St. Patrick. I'd hoped you'd pay us a visit this morning. Your agent was non-committal, so I wasn't sure what to think.
I heard you were going to be celebrating the saints this morning. I thought, since it's my feast day, I'd stop by and say hello.
Great.
You know, it's funny, 1,600 years ago, I wouldn't have known what a Unitarian Universalist was. But then some of you probably don't know the legends about me, so I guess we're even. Okay, the story of how I became a saint begins where every person's story does, I suppose. Way back around 385, I was born in Britain, which generations before had come under Roman control. My parents were some of the Romans who were in charge of the British colonies. Although my dad was a Christian deacon and my grandfather a priest, I wasn't very interested in church when I was a child. But everything changed when I was about 16. That's the year a band of Irish pirates captured me and took me to Ireland, where they forced me to work as a sheep herder. My master treated me very harshly, and the work was backbreaking. I felt powerless and afraid I would never see my parents again, and that's when I turned to God, since there was no one else to help me. But I didn't just get religion during my 4 years of slavery. I also picked up the language and the customs of the Celtic people. Both of these things would come to help me later in the years ahead. One night when I was about 20 years old, I dreamt that God told me to leave Ireland. And when I awoke from that dream, I was able to make my escape. Shortly after returning home and being reunited with my family, I decided to give my life to God and to become a priest. God had comforted me while a slave and helped me make my escape, so I figured I ought to return the favor. So after years of study, I eventually became a priest. Everything was going along just fine until one night I had another dream. In that dream, I heard voices telling me, come back, and walk once more among us. And in the dream, I knew I had to go back to Ireland and tell the people about the comfort and freedom and love that God had given me and how all of that had saved my life. Around this time, I was appointed Bishop of Ireland, and I spent the rest of my life traveling around the island, telling people about God, converting the Celts to Christianity, and helping the Irish people build schools and churches for themselves. I died 1,552 years ago today, and legends about me have been growing ever since. People love to tell about how I used the three-leaf clover to teach about the Trinity. Something tells me that's not a lesson to dwell on here. But then there's the tale that I drove all the snakes out of Ireland, and there is even a story about my walking stick and how it grew into a tree. I could tell you what really happened, but I think every man deserves to be left a little mystery. People today have all sorts of opinions about whether I should have converted the Celts to Christianity, but I will tell you this: I watched with joy as Irish history was documented and great works of art were made even after Rome fell. And I was grateful that the schools we built and the education and the good works we began during my lifetime allowed Ireland to shine like a beacon as the rest of Europe fumbled in the Dark Ages. I suppose that's how I became a saint. It wasn't just because of what I did, but because of what was possible through me, and because I'd been willing to go where God felt God had called me.
Well, that is quite a story, and I'm sure we'd love to hear even more about your life and ministry, but I know that you have lots of other churches to visit today. Not to mention all of the intercessory prayer calls you're getting now that the Cardinals have chosen a new pope. So on behalf of the congregation, I thank you.
I'll be watching you, First Parish in Milton, and I'll be waiting to see where God calls you and for all of the good things that come through your work and your lives. God bless you.
Thank you, St. Patrick.
Thank you.
So we have a new song that we're going to learn this morning to sing our children and teachers to their religious education classes. And I'm going to sing it once through, and then we'll all sing it twice together, and then the children and teachers will be invited to go to their classes.
Amen.
Maybe it's because of the election of the new pope, or maybe it's just because I've recently been reading up on saints, but the memory of my first Catholic Mass has been on my mind a lot this week. It was my second year of college, and I had worked out an internship with the neighborhood Roman Catholic Church. They got a free choir director, and I got 4 praxis credits toward my music degree. I'd been very involved in my Unitarian Universalist church back home and had visited my best friend's Methodist church countless times. So other than a lot more praying and standing and kneeling than I was used to, I figured, how different could it be? As a way to introduce me to the congregation, and perhaps also as a cautionary move on their part, the organist and priests had decided that I should spend my first Sunday with them simply observing worship until communion, during which I would sing a couple of solos. So on the day of, I sat through the Mass, enjoying the vestments, the rhythmic language, and the elaborate rituals. And when we finally got to communion, I began singing the first song they'd chosen, "Let Us Break Bread Together." Let us break bread together on our knees, on our knees. Let us break bread together on our knees. Now the next line is supposed to go, when I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun. Well, what came out of my mouth was, when I fall on my face with my knees to the rising sun. I'm not sure if it was just because I was a college student awake at 9 in the morning or because I was nervous about singing in front of about 1,000 people. But anyway, after that, I certainly did need the Lord to have mercy on me. Of course, I was embarrassed that I'd sung the wrong words, and I remember feeling relieved when the congregation laughed at my mistake. Unfortunately, the priests were doing anything but laughing. And though I wasn't sure exactly why, I knew that I had offended them. Having never attended Mass before that day, bringing no understanding of Catholicism beyond what I'd learned in European history class, I decided I needed to learn a bit more about the beliefs of the church where I would be interning. So I signed up for RCIA, the congregation's crash course in Catholicism. I realize now that I probably gave the poor seminarian teaching that class an ulcer with all of my theology questions, but I learned a lot. Having been raised in a humanist church, what stood out most to me about this new faith were all of the miracles. Signs and instruments of God's grace, the sacraments can be understood as gateways to miracles. Each and every Mass offers parishioners the opportunity not just to witness a miracle, but to actually be fed, body and soul, at God's own miraculous and mysterious table. And nearly every other day, it seemed, the faithful are invited to celebrate the feast of a saint through whom at least 2 miracles had come to pass. Now, I was familiar with the sacraments, having been baptized a few years before, and having worshiped in churches with open communion tables many times. But this business about the saints was new to me. It wasn't until years later when I went to seminary that I learned much more about saints, Catholic or otherwise. The best description I came across was in a book called Making Saints by Kenneth Woodward. He writes, "A saint is always someone through whom we catch a glimpse of what God is like and of what we are called to be. Only God makes saints, of course. The church merely identifies from time to time a few of these for emulation. The church then tells the story. But the author is the source of the grace by which the saints live. And there we have it. A saint is someone whose story God tells." Now, this was very different from what I'd always thought a saint was. After all, I'd learned in RCIA that for a saint to be canonized or recognized by the church as someone whom the living ought to emulate, a formal process is required with reports and confirmation of at least 2 posthumous miracles. It's a process that can take hundreds of years. And then there was what the Puritans, our forebears in this church, taught about sainthood. As Teresa mentioned earlier this morning, the Puritans rather cheerfully focused on the idea that saints live among us in the here and now. But they also taught that the world was mostly filled with people who weren't saints, and therefore weren't admitted into communion, and who wouldn't be joining the cloud of witnesses in heaven after death. Of saints sure raise a lot of questions, don't they? If a saint is someone through whom we catch a glimpse of what God is like, why should only the dead be worthy of official sainthood? And if only a precious few people are saints and everyone else is doomed, why would God bother creating such a big human family in the first place? And for that matter, why even bother with saints at all? After all, St. Patrick didn't just offer the love of Christ to the Irish who wanted it. He used sometimes violent means to eradicate any native spirituality he couldn't find a way to appropriate. And then there's Martin Luther King Jr., who's widely thought to have been a womanizer. Gandhi had a strange and uneasy relationship with his children, and his teachings reinforced an oppressive caste system. And even Jesus once called a Syro-Phoenician woman a dog, and in John's Gospel used a whip to drive the moneylenders out of the temple. Given the realities of human nature, we are left to wonder, why should we trust anything someone did or said or taught if they were also capable of doing wrong? You're either good or bad, right? The Reverend Meg Barnhouse, minister of the First UU Church in Austin, wrestled with this question too. But as she writes, she realized that the ancient Greek heroes all had flaws, and their gods had flaws. The characters moving through the Hebrew scriptures had flaws, yet they're held up as models of faithfulness and bravery. Where did I get this idea that the people in my shrine should be perfect? Indeed, where do we get this idea that people worthy of admiration, people worthy to be followed and emulated should be perfect? After all, St. Moses the Black was a murderer. St. Longinus of poking none other than the crucified Christ himself. And God still saw fit to use their lives to manifest goodness and love and mercy in the world. If they had been flawless, there wouldn't be much point in the rest of us trying to follow them, now would there? My musical service at that Catholic church certainly didn't get off to a perfect start. And yet I like to think that I offered something of goodness and kindness to those people. And the 2 years that I spent with that faithful and caring congregation hold some of my most cherished memories. We need not be all good for some good to come through us. We all have some good and some not so good in us, don't we? Just because we've done some bad things doesn't mean we're all bad. Of course not. Or this church and every other church would be out of business, wouldn't it? Saints don't need to be perfect to give us a glimpse of the sacred. As St. Francis of Assisi once said, I have been all things unholy. If God can work through me, God can work through anyone. So, my friends, what if one of our spiritual practices was to say no to the cynicism that tells us nothing and no one is perfect and can therefore never really be trusted? What if we commit to say yes to the faith that even the most broken of vessels can be used for holy purposes? What if we commit to paying attention for the miraculous flowing through us, flowing through our lives? And what if each of us were to strive to be a saint? As Richard Rohr writes in his book, Everything Belongs, The Gift of Contemplative Prayer, once I can see the mystery here and trust the mystery even in this little piece of clay that I am, in this moment of time that I am, then I can also see it in you and eventually in all things. Any attempt by any religion to say God is here and not there is pure heresy. God is in all things, precisely in God's ever newness and God's ever possibility. So, my siblings in spirit, resting in that never-ending presence in, with, and among us, assured by the Spirit's ever newness and ever possibility, and on this festive St. Patrick's Day, may we each find relief from the pursuit of perfection. May we come to expect miracles. May we learn to trust the mystery in the little pieces of clay that we are. May we become saints whose lives bear witness to grace, all in the service of love. Amen. I now invite you to remain seated while we sing our next hymn, number 1008 in your teal songbook, When Our Heart is in a Holy Place. And after the hymn has ended, let us enter into a few moments of silence together.
In this holy place, with our holy and imperfect hearts, our joyful and struggling existence, we lift up the spirit of the prayer of St. Patrick as our own. Let us pray. We arise today through a mighty strength, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. We arise today through the strength of God among us in human form, through the blessing of baptism, through the trials of life, through the joys and sorrows that greet us each day. We arise today through the strength of love, in obedience of angels, in the service of the archangels, in hope of resurrection to meet with reward, in prayers of forebears, in predictions of prophets, in preachings of apostles, in faiths of confessors, in deeds of righteous people everywhere. We arise today through the strength of heaven, light of sun, brilliance of moon, splendor of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of sea, stability of earth, firmness of rock. We arise today with the Spirit's strength to pilot us, God's might to uphold us, holy wisdom to guide us, God's eye to look before us, God's ear to hear us, wisdom's word to speak for us, God's hand to guard us. May the sacred's way lie before us, the Spirit's shield protect us. We summon today all of those powers between us and that which might destroy, against every cruel and merciless power that might oppose our bodies and our souls, against incantations of false prophets, against the false gods of greed and militarism, against every knowledge that endangers humanity's body and soul. And we lift up the prayers and struggles among us today. With Paul, we hold a prayer for his friend Dean, whose father has lymphoma, and friends of Allie, who lost a child to illness. We hold in our hearts all of those within and beyond our community who struggle with every illness of mind, body, and spirit, those who are loved ones and caregivers, for all of those awaiting diagnosis, awaiting change or new life in relationships, for those who are ready to bring forth the newness of spring in their lives and in their hearts. We share in the joy of the rest of the day and the week. We share with Kristin the joy on the occasion of Christian's ordination to the UU ministry this afternoon. We share with Deb Larson Venable joy this week at her 30th recovery anniversary. And with Jeff, we share joyful memories of celebrating St. Patrick's with his uncles over home in Pittsburgh. For all of the many joys that greet us just on the horizon, we give thanks this day. God with us, God before us, God behind us, God in us, God beneath us, God above us, God on our right, God on our left, God in breadth, God in length, God in height, God in the heart of everyone who thinks of us, God in the mouth of everyone who speaks of us, God in every eye that sees us, God in every ear that hears us. So may it be. So may we be whole. Amen.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Julie Baker, also known as Ruby and Zane's mom. I was raised Catholic and attended Mass in my church clothes every single Sunday from my days in the cry room until I was 15. As a teenager, I was thoroughly convinced that I was burning in hell for any number of possible infractions, so I was thrilled when my parents' divorce freed me from the hypocrisy of weekly Mass and CCD classes. Although I developed a relationship with a loving higher power in early adulthood, I never felt the need for church again until almost 20 years later when I was pregnant with my daughter Ruby. I was terrified that if I didn't find some kind of spiritual alternative by the time she was born, family members would pressure us into baptizing Ruby in the Catholic Church. Plus, I wanted to give her a religion she could rebel against later in life. Friends had suggested that the Unitarian Church might be right up my alley. We started going to First Church in JP, and when Ruby was 4 months old, we invited our family members to a naming celebration where she was welcomed into the world with the water of a rose while wearing a purple velvet dress. Although I struggled with becoming too suburban, commuting to JP on Sunday mornings made it difficult to make it to church. So, on the Sunday before September 11th, 2001, we came to First Parish in Milton. Then that horrible day happened. And like many people, I was spiritually heartbroken. I had huge questions about good, evil, and how the heck I could teach my child about universal love in a world where people hated enough to turn planes into weapons and feared enough to jump out of skyscraper windows. I remember walking into this church that morning and thinking, these Milton UUs better knock my socks off or I am out of here. And you did. And that's why I'm still here. You didn't have all the answers for me, and still don't, but we encourage each other to keep asking questions. And church clothes are whatever we feel like wearing that day. And God is at the beach on many summer Sundays. I'm not the same person who showed up in this meeting house more than a decade ago. My outside circumstances have changed a lot. Some of those changes weren't easy. I had serious complications when I was pregnant with my son Zane. I had to live in the hospital for a month before he was born, and Zane had to spend his first 2 months of life in the NICU. I've been through a divorce with 2 small children. I moved. I was diagnosed with MS. I had to stop driving. My father died, and late last year, I was laid off from my job. And First Parish has been there to support my kids and me every step of the way. You've helped me see that, like Jonah in the story we heard a couple weeks ago, these challenges have been transformative. Gifts in ugly packaging. You've also been here for all the good stuff. I started getting healthy by working out at the Y with my church lady friends. You give me rides, large print hymnals, parenting advice. People always make sure there are gluten and dairy-free treats for me at coffee hour and church gatherings. We go to the movies, concerts, plays, share meals and coffee, go for sweaty walks, our Facebook friends, and our kids play together. You are my people, my village, and I can't imagine my life without you. I came here to give my children a spiritual community, but I've gotten so much more. As a single mom, I don't have a lot of money to contribute, but I try to express my gratitude by giving back where and how I can. I've taught RE classes, helped lead a service based on a Depeche Mode song, participated in a going-away flash mob, take part in small group ministries, have served on different committees, and my kids and I come to almost every single church gathering we're invited to. And now that I have a new job that I'm starting tomorrow, I hope to add to my financial contribution as well. Although I was nervous about giving my testimonial this morning, I'm grateful to Kristin for asking me. It's given me the opportunity to think about all the reasons I love First Parish. Thank you.
Our offering will be given and received in the spirit of generosity.
In my glory.
invite you to join in singing our final hymn, number 121 in your gray hymnal, We'll Build a Land.
love make our hearts its dwelling place, that we may live with the light of hope in our eyes, bearing words of truth in our hearts, building the land that God has planned where love shines through this day and evermore. And the congregation said, Amen.